A journalist visiting America in 1860 wrote, "There are several kinds of power working at the fabric of this republic: water power, steam power, and Irish power. The last,
A
was
journalist
hardest
visiting.
of all." Irish Americans continue to power America, from building our infrastructure, to healing the sick, to rushing into harm's way as others run out. Irish names are prominent on all our rolls of valor, including 257 recipients of the Medal of Honor that list Ireland as their birthplace. Without Irish Americans, Helen Keller would not have had her miracle worker. The marginalized would have lost a voice. We would not have been challenged to reach for the moon. But the most significant contribution of Irish Americans is the story of a people who arrived from their homeland with little more than energy and determination, who have contributed and excelled in every aspect of American society, defining the American dream. March is Irish American Heritage Month.
You are very welcome to the first segment of the 2022 Ancient Order of Hibernians Irish American Heritage Month webinar. Today, our webinar, The Coffin Ship, Life and Death at Sea During on Gorta Mór, The Great Hunger, will be presented by our national historian, Dan Taylor. Dan?
Thank you, Danny. When I was a boy in school, we were taught that there had been a famine in Ireland in the 1840s. The Irish people, it seems, for some reason, had relied heavily upon the common potato for their sustenance. And when a blight struck the potato crop in 1845, we were taught 1 million or more Irish people died and another 1 million or 2 emigrated. That was the textbook explanation. Of course, at home, I had learned from my father, as he had learned from his mother and she from her father, that there was more to the story. The narrative as remembered and passed from generation to generation in Irish America was quite different from what we were taught in school. In my house, as in many Irish American homes, the British government bore responsibility for what was frequently called the Irish potato famine. Now, while some truths are obscured by the passage of time, the history of what we call in Irish on Gorta Mór, the Great Hunger, has been the subject of a considerable amount of scholarship and re-examination since my school days. In fact, on June 1st of 1997, the Irish actor Gabriel Byrne took the stage at a festival in County Cork commemorating the 150th anniversary of the Great Hunger and read a letter from then British Prime Minister Tony Blair. Mr. Blair acknowledged in the letter that those who governed in London at the time failed their people through standing by while a crop failure turned into a massive human tragedy. Mr. Blair also observed that 1 million people should have died in what was then part of the richest and most powerful nation in the world is something that still causes pain as we reflect on it today. The Great Hunger, as Mr. Blair acknowledged, created a deep and lasting scar in Anglo-Irish relations. The enormity of the suffering and trauma experienced by their forebears 175 years ago is also reflected in the persistent collective memory of a worldwide Irish diaspora that has now grown to the tens of millions. Today, 25 years after Mr. Blair's acknowledgement, the historical examination and re-examination of the Great Hunger continues. Regardless of one's perspective, the essential statistics speak to the enormity of the calamity. Ireland was populated by more than 8 million souls before the Great Hunger. By 1851, the official census showed a decline of 1.5 million, and by 1891, there were less than 5 million people inhabiting the country. Remarkably, it is only today that the population has begun approaching 8 million again. But our presentation today is not so much concerned with the cause or causes of the Great Hunger. It is not concerned with the complicity of a government or governments or factors of that sort. Instead, in this, the first of our Irish Heritage Month webinars for 2022, we're focusing on the experience of the more than 1 million men, women, and children who made their way from Ireland to North America and other destinations around the world during the Great Hunger. It is perhaps because of the sheer scale of the event that we tend to think of those who emigrated in abstract collective terms. We tend to describe this mass exodus in poetic, lyrical terms. But there's a danger in such an approach, I think, to the extent that it leads us to consider those who managed to leave Ireland as passive victims to whom a horrible thing happened. Our special guest today, Professor Cian McMahon, has published a work of original scholarship that examines in marvelous detail the arduous journey undertaken by these Irish immigrants. And he's done so with a level of detail that I think in many ways restores to them their individual humanity. In Professor McMahon's book, The Coffin Ship, and in his presentation today, I think you will find that those who left Ireland in the so-called coffin ships were resourceful, determined individuals who overcame incredible challenges to transport themselves, their families, and in many cases, their neighbors and friends to new lands in which they could survive and flourish. Our guest today, Professor McMahon, was born in Dublin in 1975, the eldest of 5 children. His mother's family is from County Kilkenny and his father from County Clare. While growing up in Dublin, Cian attended a Gaelic immersion school where all of his classes, including history, were taught in the Irish language. In 1988, he and his family became 20th century modern Irish immigrants to Canada and lived in Winnipeg, Manitoba, about 8 hours due north of Minneapolis. After finishing high school and college in Canada, Cian moved back to Ireland to complete a master's degree in Irish history at University College Dublin before he moved again, this time to my hometown, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where he began a PhD in Irish history at Carnegie Mellon University under the late great Professor David W. Miller. After finishing his PhD, Cian moved out west to teach at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. He currently lives there with his wife and 4 children. Today, Dr. McMahon comes to us from Boston, where he's conducting further historical research in the archives of Boston College, which many of you know was a Jesuit-founded institution back in 1863, largely to educate the Irish American immigrant population. And so with that, I turn the floor over, Professor McMahon.
Hello, and thank you. Give me a second here to pull up my screen. And you can hear and see that okay, Dan?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you very much for this. Thank you to Dan for that kind introduction, to Danny O'Connell and everyone else at the National AOH for the kind invitation. It's flattering. It's exciting. I'm very grateful to be here. As Dan said, I probably work on the history of immigration because I am an immigrant myself. I've actually immigrated twice now, once to Canada and then to the United States. You can see there on the screen the cover for my new book, which I'll be talking about today, The Coffin Ship. And you can see there's a discount code there in block letters at the bottom. I'll say that discount code only works if you go through the nyupress.org website. Yeah, so I'm here to talk to you today about The Coffin Ship, which is an examination of the lived experience of the immigrants themselves during on Gorta Mór between 1845 and 1855. As Dan said, this isn't a book about the British government. It's not about complicity. I'm not tackling that issue. I'm interested in the lived experience of the everyday people themselves. As many of you know, the coffin ship is a term that we use a lot, both in everyday conversation and in scholarly circles, but it's a phrase that everyone uses, but as Dan suggested, it's one that I don't think we really think about enough. And so that's what I wanted to do. So I dedicated about 8 years to reading and writing about this, and I'm going to share a brief précis of what I learned with you today. The idea for the book actually came to me when I was not reading or writing or thinking about Irish history. I went to while at Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh. I went over the hollow to the University of Pittsburgh to see a lecture. There's lectures every once in a while, and it was just another one. I went where Professor Marcus Rediker at the University of Pittsburgh was talking about a new project that he was working on, which was called the Slave Ship. And so I thought, that sounds interesting. Life on a slave ship. I'll go along. And as I was walking home that night, I thought, wow, we need that kind of perspective. What would it look like if we wrote a book like that about the experiences at sea? But what would it look like if it was about Irish history? And then it just dawned on me, of course, the Coffin Ship. So I'm going to take about 25 minutes to talk to you today. And then Dan might have some questions. I'm happy to answer questions. Take it from there. So the first part, my talk has two parts. The first part is the majority of the talk is to discuss the coffin ships, as I said, as lived experience. So I want to talk about the book itself, the main intellectual pillars on which it stands, the kinds of sources that I used, the arguments, like what I learned basically, and the ways in which I organized the chapters in support of those arguments. So that's the main part of the talk. But I'll also more briefly, having told you about what life was like on these ships themselves, I want to zoom out a little bit and investigate and talk a little bit about this phrase, the coffin ship, about the genealogy, if you will, of the phrase coffin ship. I was interested when I finished the book. I mean, was the term used at the time? And if not, when did it start being used? By whom did it start being used, and when? So that gives you a sense of the two parts that I'll be talking about today. So this is a project about American immigration, but it's one that argues that in order to understand American immigration, we need to put it in its broader international or transnational context. Okay, let me change my screen here. So you probably all know, or some of you are probably familiar with this image. This is a bronze statue by an Irish artist named John Behan. It was unveiled in Murrisk, County Mayo in 1996 as part of the sesquicentennial commemoration of the famine, so the 150 years. As Dan said, and as many of you probably did, I first heard about coffin ships, the term coffin ships, when I was a young boy growing up in Ireland in the 1980s. And our teachers described these emigrant vessels in very stark, grim terms. The mortality rates were out of control, the crews were brutal, the captains were heartless, the weather seemingly was always terrible. The ships were poorly equipped lumber freighters that were unsuited for human cargo at the height of the crisis. And this is true. In 1848, an Irish rebel named Thomas D'Arcy McGee, who many of you will know, a young Ireland rebel, gave a speech in which he decried the immigrant packet ships, which have become, and I'm quoting him here, have become sailing coffins and carried immigrants to a new world indeed, not to America, but to eternity. Now, the goal of this emotive but one-dimensional image of the coffin ship was pretty clear to me even as a kid, right? It was designed to commemorate the suffering and deaths of those who left Ireland during the famine, because there was a lot of suffering that happened during that time. As Dan pointed out, between 1845 and 1852, out of a base population of 8.5 million, 1 million people died in Ireland. Over the decade as a whole, so from 1845 to 1855, if you look at the bell curve of emigration, it doesn't go back to pre-famine numbers until 1855. So if you look at the whole bell curve, it's an 11-year period, and during that time, over 2 million people emigrated. So 1 million died and 2 million emigrated. by any measure, this is one of the great flash floods of human history. And by extension, living in working class Dublin in the 1980s, in the context of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, guns and bombs in the streets, being used to being used in the service of political independence from Ireland, the hunger strikes, that's all going on. Commemorating the suffering during the famine, made sense to me. And I could see it as part of an ongoing ledger of British misgovernment. But the thing is that over the years, as I kind of took on history as a career, and just being myself, I started to think about the term coffin ships again, and it began to curdle a little bit in my mind. And because while the term was originally used to commemorate those who suffered and died, right, which is good, I actually came to realize that maybe it had started doing the opposite, right? By portraying immigrants as prone dead bodies lying in the belly of a ship, the phrase coffin ship, in my mind, had actually started to strip them of their individuality, their creativity, their bravery, ultimately, let's be honest, their humanity, their liveliness. So inspired by the work of people like Marcus Rediker, who's written fantastic books on what life was like on pirate ships, Navy ships, mutinies, slave ships, I started to think to myself, what if we wrote a book about what life was like for those Irish immigrants who left Ireland in the 1840s and 50s? And ultimately, I hoped that by thinking about the Irish in this new way, that we might start to think about other immigrant groups too. And as the Irish like to do, lead the way. So to do all that, I realized that I was going to need to write a book that was going to stand on 3 intellectual pillars, and I'll list them very briefly for you here, right? The first one was that I needed the book to be based on the voices of the immigrants themselves. Bang. It's not good enough. It's not going to be good enough for me, I decided, to write on what landlords thought, what the workhouses thought, what the government thought. That's why I told you I'm not debating the complicity during this. I'm interested in what the average everyday person experienced. But I wanted it to be based on the immigrants themselves. So that's like the first one. I wanted to prioritize the voices of the everyday people themselves. The second thing was that I wanted to bring maritime social history into Irish history and Irish studies. Most books on the Irish famine, Gorta Mór, most books skip over the voyage as like this thing that was to be endured. I wanted to flip that model. I wanted to make the voyage be the center stage of this great human drama, this human saga. And finally, I wanted to compare and contrast, but also to connect the Irish at home and abroad during this time. So I'm interested in the ways in which people who have already emigrated are sending letters back to those who are about to come. And then when those folks come, how they communicate back to their friends and family. Okay. So very briefly, this is what the book looks like. This is the chapter. The book's about the lived experiences of the immigrants themselves, right? So why not make the book be about the voyage? Why not each chapter give you another step in the voyage? So that's what I do. So you can see it goes from preparing to getting to the ship's embarkation, life at sea, death at sea, and then arrival. And when I talk about arrival, I'm literally talking about the first few days of arrival. I don't track these people for months and years into their. Other historians have done that. I wanted to learn what are the skills and strategies that people used when they first landed in what was a strange and new world. So chapter 1 is entitled Preparation, and it looks how people gathered the resources to leave. And it addresses a paradox which I was chatting about with Dan the other day, which is this, is that if the economy collapsed and it was so bad that 1 million people died, right, which we know happened, yet how did 2 million people immigrate? Like, how did that many people figure out ways to get, well, the answer is they're creative. The answer is that they're trying different things. The answer is that they're finding multiple multiple income streams and overlapping them. So I found that in chapter 1, I found that people gathered the funds to leave from a wide range of sources. Friends and family were by far the most important, but it's also true that when it suited them, immigrants could turn to landlords, workhouses, colonial imperial governments, right? Because Australia is part of the story too. I'm interested in how people got off the island. A lot of times people aren't saying, oh, I want to go to the United States. I want to go to Canada. They're more interested in like, where can I go now in the next week or two, right? So I don't care where they went. There's some people who go to Britain and that's where they stay. That's fine. I'm interested in those people too. I'm interested in people emigrating. It's not just the story of the United States. So private charity is another part. This I wanted to show you is a prepaid ticket. The Philadelphia crew out there are going to love this one because this ticket was bought in Philadelphia in 1840. It was bought on the 26th of February 1846, as you can see there on the right. And it's from a packet ship company called the Cope family. They ran ships that went from Philadelphia to Liverpool. So if you were somebody who had emigrated to the United States in, let's say, the 1830s, early 1840s, you made a bit of money, you wanted to send it back to family, you could go into the Cope family office and you could buy this prepaid ticket. Okay. And then what you do is you fold it up, you put it in an envelope, and you mail it home. And your friend or family member takes this prepaid ticket, goes to Liverpool, and hands in the ticket. The ticket is then cut in half. So the passenger keeps half a ticket as a receipt to prove that they really belong there, and the captain takes the other half. The captain takes his half, puts it in a leather satchel. He carries it on the ship, and when he gets back to Philadelphia with his emigrants, he gives it to the Cope family. The Cope family puts it in a box, and when the Cope family package ships shut down and the business closes, those papers are lodged in the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. So that's an unbroken string from an immigrant who carried this ticket to you taking the bus downtown, going into the Historical Society of Pennsylvania and looking at them. Now, when people bought these tickets, I said that the ticket was cut in half. But before they sent the ticket, folks often wrote letters and advice on the back of the ticket, okay, to explain to their friends and family how to do it, where to go, what to bring, etc. Now, they're all cut in half, so they're not full letters, and they're not signed, so I don't know who wrote them. But you can see on this ticket, for example, on the front half was, as I said, bought on February 26th. And on the back half, there's some advice. So sometimes I said people give advice that was like, here, you got to be here at this time. It's a financial instrument, right? This is worth cash money. But you can also see that sometimes people said things like, don't be worried, you'll be okay. In fact, I'm quoting here from this very letter here. It says, you need not be afraid, for the ship that you are to come in is just as safe as if you were sitting at Mr. McGee's fireside. As if you're sitting at Mr. McGee's fireside, right? So there's a real person, there's a Mr. McGee out there. You know what I mean? Like, these people know each other. They're relying on friends and family for help. I said to you that I was interested in how people got off the island, and I wasn't really interested in drawing distinctions between how they got off. Remember that this is still the mid-1800s when people were being transported as convicts to Australia. The song, The Fields of Athenry, is about this. People were being transported to Australia for a range of petty crimes. So I was surprised to learn that many Irish people, from the children and spouses of convicts, but also to spies, to matrons, to military pensioners, and even some of the convicts themselves, were actually using these convict ships as a free ride to Australia. So this is the petition of two sisters, Joanna and Mary Kelleher. I'm not going to ask you to read it, of course. I'm not going to read it out to you. I'll give you the overview. This is a petition. They're writing to the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, who is the head of the executive. He's the top dog of the British government in Ireland. And this is a petition from two sisters, Joanna and Mary Kelleher. Their mother had been convicted of theft and sentenced to 7 years transportation, right? When this happened, the sisters ran out and stole 2 shirts with the intention of being sent as convicts to Australia with their mother. on the same ship. But here's the rub. The judge sentenced them to 12 months in prison. So they didn't get what they want. They were right back where they started. They're sitting in prison instead of being transported with their mother. This petition explains that story and asks if they can be sent as free settlers. In other words, not as convicts, but as free emigrants on a convict ship to Australia. Crazy thing is, it worked. Even crazier, I was reading through the journals of surgeons, and I found one of these sisters got sick on their journey. And so I got more on these sisters. But the point is that if you're looking at friends, family, there's also landlord assistance. There's boxes in the National Library of Ireland of people asking their landlords, hey, listen, I've been a good tenant. I've known you a long time. If I pull down my house, in other words, if I take my house off of your taxable income, can I get a free ride to Quebec or to the United States? And that worked. But the point is that people are being creative. They're using lots of different ways to get off the island. This is we don't have any cameras or photographs in Ireland during this time. So this is the closest that we'll ever get to a photograph of the famine that I know of. There are people who claim they have photographs of the famine, but if you look closely, they're actually from later. But this one, this is chapter 2, and it looks at embarkation, which is about the ways in which people made it from their rural cottages, sometimes in the middle of nowhere, to the port towns and the cities where their ships were anchored. So what kinds of things did they buy before they left? What kinds of things did they sell? How did they travel? Railways, canals, horse and cart, many times walking, right? The poorest of the poor are the ones who can't afford a trip on a train or a canal, so they have to walk. But because they're the poorest of the poor, they also have less food. They also have worse clothing. So the ones who are walking are in a double negative. They're the ones who are least capable of doing so. The ways in which folks dealt with problems, delayed departures was a big thing. Oh yeah, your ship's not leaving for a week. Like when you're living on a shoestring, to be sitting in a port town a long way from home for a week is a big deal. That, not to mention the frauds, the thieves, the bullies, called land sharks, man catchers, runners in places like Liverpool, but also places like Cork, also places like Dublin. A lot of the fraud that's going on is actually Irish immigrants in Liverpool using their connections. Irish people meeting other Irish people and saying, look, sure, we're both Irish, I'll take care of you, and then defrauding them. So it's very hard to find out who do you trust in these places. And finally, chapter 2 looks at how they settled in to the ships, how they found the best berths, right? Because the ship, it's not like every bed's the same. Some parts of the ship are the best. You want to be in the middle of the ship, right? Because that's the part that moves the least. People were writing these pieces of advice to each other on letters and giving them. And then finally, making new friends. If you're traveling by yourself for 5-6 weeks at sea, you're going to want some friends there. This is another prepaid ticket. It's advice on the back of a ticket. And this ties in with chapter 3, which is called Life. It's called Life, but it's about life at sea. So I'm interested in the social dynamics of life at sea. Deep sea sailing vessels in this period were designed to reflect the power structures in land. So they're strictly hierarchical, they're patriarchal, they're sexist. Immigrants are subject to violence from above. Now, many immigrants learned how to work within those systems, in part because they had been dealing with people like this before in places like workhouses, people like landlords. But others learned to fight back, often by forming solidarities that transcended traditional bonds. So for a lot of folks in Ireland, rural folks in Ireland in the 1840s, their sense of togetherness, their sense of community is really rooted strongly in blood, in place, in history, in marriage. And so that's why you have people from 2 towns, let alone 2 counties, beating each other up on canals, right? Because there's big differences in terms of identities. But on a sailing ship, you don't have that kind of luxury. You don't necessarily have those kinds of friendships and community. So you need to make friends with people that you're not used to. This also can break itself out in terms of women helping each other with childbirth, people sharing food, people entertaining each other, dancing, some booze, right? Some booze, fighting back against sailors. All of these kinds of solidarities. I look at all these intricate ways in which people ganged up together. And I also looked at the ways in which what happened when you tried to do it yourself. It didn't go so well. So this is, anyway, as a primary source. It's another piece of advice. It's a young woman being warned to stay in steerage. So steerage is the belly of the ship where the emigrants are spending most of their day. And she's being told, under any circumstances, don't have anything to say to the sailors. Stay in your berth. It is a great custom with young girls coming to this country to be chatting to the sailors, right? I can tell you one thing. If one of my daughters was getting on a ship by herself to spend 5 weeks at sea on a ship being run by a bunch of dudes, I'd be telling her to stay in her bed at night too, So this is based on past experience. But it's not all terrible. People are also getting together and entertaining themselves. It's 5 or 6 weeks. Here we can see the compartment that people lived in. It's called steerage. So you can see on the left, there are bunks, there are flat shelves, wooden shelves that are basically designed into 6 by 6 foot boxes, right? They have a lip on them so stuff doesn't roll out. And each of those 6 foot by 6 foot boxes can hold up to 4 people. So you thinking, I'm not a mathematician, but if you divide 6 by 4, you get 1 and a bit. That's how much like bed space you have to yourself. That also means that if you're traveling by yourself or you're traveling with your brother, guess what? You're sharing one of those wooden boxes with 2 strangers, and all the stuff that goes into them and all the stuff that goes out of them while they're at sea. So it's a place where people are being crammed together. You can see on the right there, that man standing who's pointing at the dancers. He's holding on to the mast. The mast of the ship, of course, goes from the very bottom all the way up through steerage, all the way up to the top of the sails. So steerage is this big, long wooden room that's in the middle of the ship. It's not at the very bottom of the ship, because that's the hold where they keep casks of food and fresh water and cargo. It's not at the top because that's the exposed deck. This is steerage. And it's the place where people spent most of their time. In terrible weather, sailors locked the hatches heading down into steerage, which meant it was a dark, stuffy, smelly, difficult place to be. So that's life at sea. You can see that entertaining them is part of the story. The 4th chapter is called Death. And I wanted to look at death in a few ways. It looks at the experiences at sea, but it does so in 3 different ways. So the chapter on death has 3 sections. The first one is on statistics. I've heard the 20% mortality rate during the famine for so long now, I figured I'll pull out the statistics and see what happens. But I didn't just want to talk about statistics. I'm also interested in the ways in which death and dying impacted those social dynamics of people at sea. And the 3rd section is emigrant death on land. The ways in which people left at home or who are waiting for their loved ones thought about death and responded to death. So it's generally been accepted since these years, the popular accepted mortality rate on immigrant ships during the famine is around 20%. And people usually kind of only ever seem to suggest that 1847 is the only year worth talking about. But I learned a couple of things. First thing I learned is that my research points out that it's true that 1847 was a terrible year and the mortality rates were elevated. But it's also, let's be honest, true that 95% of immigrants did not sail in that year, right? So there's 2.2 million people. 1847 is by no means the highest year. The highest years for immigration in terms of annual numbers are 1850, 51, and 52. Those are the years when it's up over 200,000. So the first thing anyway is that 1847 is not the be all end all. The second thing is that outside of 1847, Irish immigrant mortality rates were more or less on par with those of Europeans in general, which means somewhere between 1 to 2.5% mortality rate. So if you're a European, English, Welsh, Scottish, Irish, French, German, whatever, if you're getting on a sailing ship and crossing the Atlantic in the 1840s and 50s, there's a decent chance that 1 to 2% of the people on your ship are probably going to die. That's not going to raise any eyebrows. That's not going to surprise anyone. Outside of 1847, the Irish are experiencing that. Now, there are spikes in 1849 and 1843 due to cholera, but those cholera spikes hit all Europeans, not just the Irish. So the chapter also looks at the ways in which death and dying brought the Irish at home and abroad together in ways by serving as a way to describe and a way to rehabilitate their communal bonds. So here we see an ad in a New York newspaper published on St. Patrick's Day, 1849, in which a woman is living in Dublin. And she asks about her brother, James Beattie, in Boston. She's heard he's dead. Can someone confirm or deny that? Now, just stop and think about that. I mean, you're living in Dublin, you're taking out an ad in a newspaper in New York, asking, has anybody heard of your brother, James Beattie? You heard he's dead? I mean, there's a real sadness there, but there's also this like attempt to reach out to the community, to the Irish community in America and say, hey, can somebody tell me something? Chapter 5 is called Arrival, and it looks at the challenges facing and the strategies employed by immigrants when they first landed. This chapter only looks at the very first few days. It doesn't get into long-term settlement patterns, but it looks at the issue in 4 different ways. First of all, it looks at how Irish people banded together as they prepared to get off the ship. Like they would scrub the ship from top to bottom so it looked better for the medical personnel, medical inspectors. They would change into their Sunday best. They would help each other kind of prep themselves a little bit so they looked good, right? Second of all, it looks at how immigrant relief societies and quote unquote social betters help them with issues like money, transportation. Third, it looks at how they use the popular press, newspapers, to find friends and families. So for example, here's a family in the middle here, have arrived from Kilbride, County Roscommon. They've arrived in Buffalo. They're publishing an ad in their local paper, The American Celt, which was ironically actually run by Thomas D'Arcy McGee. And they're saying, hey, Patrick Glynn, he's out there. His family has arrived. Does anybody know Patrick Glynn? Can somebody please tell him that his family's here? Sad thing is I read like years of this newspaper. 6 months later, this ad for Patrick Glynn was still being published word for word. 6 months later, his family was still looking for him. I mean, you think about what an immigrant family can afford to spend, what it costs, not a ton, but what it costs to keep an ad in the paper. And then you think that for 6 months they're running this, gives you a sense of how people disappeared and how desperate people were to reconnect. The fourth and final part of chapter 4 is how they began to restitch their personal relationships with old and new friends as soon as they arrived. Big part of this is getting work, of course. Work in the 19th century is a lot of, you're not dropping 100 copies of your CV off. There's a lot of word by mouth. So previous immigrants are helping new immigrants. And then, of course, after making some money, they're sending the money or they're sending prepaid tickets back. So what I found in all of this was that while I thought I was writing a book about the ways in which Irish people managed to fund and execute this long, complicated journey in the midst of a catastrophe, I did all that. But I also found that the migration process was as much about the ways in which the sharing of money and advice and tickets ended up being a way in which people reconnected with each other and rehabilitated, rebuilt bonds of community. So while some historians have shown that emigration was a way that people survived the famine, which is true, I also realized that migration was a way in which the community recovered from it too. Okay, Dan, I know I'm coming close to my time limit. I can talk for another 5 minutes about the phrase, the Coffin Ship, or I can stop there. What would you prefer, Dan?
If you want to stop now, we could maybe have some questions and engage in a little conversation.
Sounds great. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Cian, for that. And I'll start the conversation.
I'm going to stop sharing here for a sec, Dan. Sorry.
All right.
There we go.
One of the things that struck me about your book is that I personally had not thought much about was you have these people in abject poverty without the means to sustain themselves, and they wish to go to North America or wherever else they're going. What is the cost of the journey, and how do they come up with it? Because when you reflect upon it, it seems unlikely that they would be able to come up with the cost of this journey. So could you elaborate a little bit more on the ways that they came up with the fare for passage?
Yeah, sure. Essentially, it's a collective enterprise in which they are chipping together bits and pieces of money from all around and putting it together. So if you're during the famine, you are looking for a way out. The cheapest ticket is going to be direct from Ireland to Quebec, Canada. That costs somewhere in the range of about £3. Now, to rent an acre of manured land at this time for a year will cost about £10. So it's a big chunk of money. It's a big chunk of money, but it's not out of range. They would do things. Part of the Irish farmers' economy was obviously, tillage farming, but they would also have extra little bits and pieces here for cash, like maybe a pig or a cow. And a pig or a cow can be traded in for cash. I got to remember they've also doing things like tools that they're not going to be using anymore. So they're able to sell tools to neighbors who are staying behind, and they can do that. There's also a tradition in Ireland at the time, which is sometimes called tenant right, and is other times called Ulster custom. And that says that, let's say I rented a farm for 10 years, and I'm giving it up. I'm moving, or I'm doing something else. I'm moving into another. I married somewhere and I'm going somewhere else. Okay. When I surrender the farm and the next family comes to rent it, that family is responsible for paying me a little bit for improvements that I've done to the place. So I built that barn. All the fences are all ready to go. They're all fixed. I manured it earlier in the spring and it's still good. So people are entitled to a little bit of cash like that. As I said, though, the reason that the statistics on migration spike towards the end of what we think of the famine, right? Because the blight ends in 52, but emigration doesn't spike till then. The reason is that all the people who emigrated in 45, 46, 47 are now able to start sending money back, enabling people to emigrate in 49, 50, 51. So families are a big part of that.
Very good. And you mentioned in the book a few examples of these tenants who are working these small tenant holdings, writing to the landlord, sort of negotiating for the fare for passage to America or wherever. And they mention in their letters that they have a house that they will tear down. Can you explain for our audience what the significance of tearing the house down on the property would have to the landlord?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I had heard that there were petitions from tenants during the famine for assisted immigration. In other words, can you pay for part or all of my travel? And they're kept. These are in the Wandesford papers. It's not the only landlord whose papers survive, but I looked at the Wandesford papers. Wandesford's in Kilkenny, And when I was looking through these papers, I found all of these handwritten little petitions, and anybody can go in and read these things. And what happened is that in a lot of them, they say, there's me, my wife, and 4 kids. We want to leave as soon as we heard that you're funding immigration, and we want to be included in the program. I have a house to tear down, or I will pull down the roof. So in terms of taxable income for a landlord, a house, a habitable house, is counted as taxable. And what they're paying is what are called the poor rates. And the poor rates are essentially the money that is used to fund the local workhouse. And so when a tenant says that they will, I mean, literally, before I leave, I will do the work of pulling down, because it's a day's work, right, to get the roof down. That the pulling down of the roof means that the landlord will pay less in terms of their poor rates. So it's in the landlord's interest to have a smaller number of big farms than it is for them to have a patchwork of subsistence farmers. The key is that immigrants, or tenants, you should say, tenants know this. They're alive to this. They're capable of looking at this from the perspective of the landlord and thinking about the degree to which they can sweeten the deal. And oftentimes after, the landlord said, yeah, okay, I also found letters to his wife saying, hey, listen, we're going to spend 6 weeks on a ship going to Quebec. I don't really have a coat. Can you give me money for a coat? Can you dress the kids? So the immigrants are dealing with the landlords not as these supplicant, like, oh, what am I going to do? They're looking at it, and they're doing the best they can under very difficult, trying conditions.
They're being resourceful and negotiating with whatever leverage they have, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and the leverage includes not just pulling down the house. Wandesford had lead mines, and a lot of these folks actually weren't farmers; they were miners, and they went straight out to places like Eastern PA to go mining in places like Pottsville, and actually I found letters literally of people who said, I have family who are out in Pottsville. I'll go out and join them. It's not going to cost much. If you just get me the ticket, as soon as I land in Philly or whatever, they'll take care of me. So people are using this. Other families use their last names Brennan. There's a lot of Brennans. The Brennans owned the land before the 17th century confiscation, where the English crown took the land. So a lot of the Brennans are using their own family history as, like a negotiating chip in a difficult situation. There's a thing that historians say, and it's very true, is like, you got to be careful when you think about the word agency when you're dealing with folks who have their backs to the wall. You know what I mean? Who don't really, like, do you really have a choice in immigration when your family's starving? I'm not trying to suggest that they had a choice, but I'm saying that they were resourceful, creative, and intelligent, brave people. That's what I'm saying.
And I know the focus of your work is on those who made it out and made the journey. Is it an oversimplification to say that among the million who died were many of those who simply could not afford the passage to America or some other location?
Yeah, when we think about immigrants leaving Ireland at this time, immigrants are not the poorest of the poor. The poorest of the poor are disproportionately affected, and are ones who die in disproportionate numbers. So you asked me earlier, we talked about how you got the money together. Well, some families could get the money together. Some families couldn't, right? And so immigrants are, when we think about immigrants and the story of immigrants, of Irish immigration to this time, we think about it as, as indigent and people in rags and stuff. And that is part of the story. But generally speaking, immigrants are people who have a little bit of something, a little bit, just enough to get themselves on the ship. So mortality rates undoubtedly disproportionately impacted the poorest of the poor.
All right, I'm going to turn this back to our national president, Danny O'Connell. I think we may have some other questions from others who want to pose them.
Yes, well, we have one posted, and then we're going to go to Martin Galvin next. But Maureen Flanagan is asking if you'd speak a little bit to the specific term coffin ship.
Yeah, very briefly. Thank you, Maureen. That's a great question. The problem is that in reading books and articles written by historians, years later about the coffin ship, I saw them using the term coffin ship all the time. But then the problem is that when I was reading newspapers, letters, diaries written during the time period, I never saw it. I mean, I only found it was used once or twice, but it had been used before in the 1820s and 30s too, so it wasn't a brand new phrase. So I got digital, they have these digitized newspapers now, which can really help you with this kind of question. And what I found was that the phrase coffin ships is actually popularized decades later, in the late 70s, 1870s and 1880s, during a period called the Land War, which runs from 1879 to 1882 in Ireland. And again is a time of political in which Irish leaders tried to bring land reform and political independence into one campaign. But the term is popularized in Irish press in the 1880s, but it's actually, they're carrying on from something from the 1870s. In 1873, an English parliamentarian who had nothing to do with Ireland was taken by the ways in which working class sailors were being sent out to sea in dangerous ships, and that the owners didn't care about the workers being sent out, and that he popularized this term, which had been floating around for decades, but he popularized it as coffin ships, right? So it's a working class, working man's term in England that then gets used in Ireland in the 1880s. And it peaks, it plays out, and then it doesn't really get popular again until the 1990s, when people start really reading and thinking about the period again. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Excellent. And joining us today on the webinar is several of our, I want to welcome several of our members of the Ladies Ancient Order Hibernians, including the National Vice President. I don't know if she has a question per se, but I know she is a tremendous historian in her own right. But the next up for a question is our Freedom for Ireland Chairman, Martin Galvin from the Bronx, New York. Martin.
Danny, I want to thank you. Professor McMahon, I want to thank you, and Dan Taylor, of course, for putting this program on. As Danny said, I'm the Freedom for Ireland Chairman, so I'm just curious. What struck me, talking about a period where people have to face these types of voyages, leaving behind everything, coming to America or Quebec or wherever they were going under those conditions. And I just wonder how much, facing all of that, going through all of that because of policies in Ireland, a great hunger as opposed to a famine, how much that shaped attitudes in which they'd be determined to try and look back, try and help Ireland get independence, get away from a government that would force them, so many immigrants, to have to go through something like that, and allow all of the resources of the country to be used for the benefit of the Irish people, so no generation would ever have to go through this again.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. That's a great question. The person who knows the most about this and who's written the most about this, of course, I'm sure you're familiar with his work, is Kirby Miller, who wrote a book in 1985 called Immigrants and Exiles. And in that, Professor Miller, who actually helped me with this project by sharing letters and diaries of his own that he had used for his work. And in it, Professor Miller makes a compelling argument that in the sense that they were not immigrants, but rather exiles from Ireland, that feeling of exile fed into the political campaign for Irish independence. And as I said to Dan, we were chatting about this before. The second half of that argument, which often gets forgotten about, is that actually that people back in Ireland who hadn't emigrated actually used that same language in ways that are tricky. Because remember, farmers who don't leave Ireland tend to have bigger farms and are more comfortable after the famine. Right. So it's a tricky rhetorical tool. I was as a great fan of Kirby Miller's, and as somebody who's gotten so much out of his work, I had hoped to find people sitting on the on the steerage writing journals and letters home saying like, oh, this is terrible. I'm really feeling we have to form a political campaign because this is terrible. I'm sitting in the bottom of the ship. What I found, Martin, was that when people were sitting at the bottom of the ship, they were mostly talking about things like, when am I going to get food? When are the sailors going to bring us fresh water? And so that broader question of the political campaign gets lost in the gritty everyday experiences of life at sea. But it's a really important question, and one that I would encourage anybody who's, even though the book was written in 1985, I mean, it's cited all the time. It's a fantastic book. It's called Immigrants and Exiles.
I would assume when you're on the ship, you're worried about surviving, but when you arrive and when you think back on what you went through, what your family went through, that's the time you might think about, hey, why did we have to go through that? Who is to blame? And why should another generation of Irish people have to go through? So that would be my assumption. I don't know if
that's true. And so because my book only looks at the first few days, but I will say that obviously I read a lot of newspapers, and it's in newspapers actually that idea and that gets articulated clearly and regularly in Irish American. The Irish American press explodes in the 1840s and 50s on the back of all these people coming in. It's a fascinating subject. It's something I looked at a little bit in my first book. It's called The Global Dimensions of Irish Identity. I'm interested in the Irish American press. It's a wonderful story.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. And Cian, we have a question from Michael Deming. How many went to live in England? Is there a number there that addresses that?
Yeah. So out of the 2.2 million, you've got about 1.5 go to the United States. It's really hard. You got to be really careful with the numbers on going to the United States, because a lot of them went to Canada first, made it sound like they were staying in Canada, and then went on to the United States. So these numbers are not. This is not TSA approved numbers. This is big beach balls getting bounced around here. But got 1.5 to the United States, about 300,000 settling in Canada. Again, I'm saying between 1845 and 1855. The numbers for Great Britain are like mainland Britain are 300,000. But the interesting question, and then the last, whatever that is, 100,000. There is Australia, New Zealand, small number go to South Africa. None are going to Argentina yet. Very few. The question, though, is how many people who ended up in places like Liverpool were planning on going on to North America, but just didn't make it.
I understand.
Like ran out of money.
Yeah. Yeah.
75% of the Irish who emigrated during this time period went through Liverpool. 75%. It would be the equivalent of O'Hare Airport.
Wow.
Maybe 20 years ago. You know what I mean? Where like, a lot of flights are going through O'Hare. So Liverpool is like that. 75%. Yeah. So a lot of people are getting to Liverpool and they're not getting any further. Sorry, Danny.
That's all right. We're going to hold you for an extra minute. A couple of great comments. This is a brilliant way to start off our Irish American Heritage Month. Sheila Jones is joining us on the Zoom, and she was talking about her grandmother who came over from County Waterford in 1912. Mm-hmm. And she just wondered if you had an idea how that would compare from the Coffin Ship times, the Great Famine time to 1912. Do you know much about that era as well?
Well, other than to say that it would have been quicker, so beginning in the 1860s into the 1870s, steamships start going back across the ocean carrying emigrants. Now, steamships are going back across the ocean from the 1820s, but they're small, they're expensive, and they're just doing things like mail. So you can send a letter and it'll get to America in about 2 weeks. And your sailing ship takes 5 or 6 weeks. So your family would know you were coming. It's kind of interesting, right?
And
so
of
by
course,
yeah.
And of course, the ships were a little bit bigger then.
Yeah.
And if we remember when the Titanic came over, it was built in Belfast, and its last port was Cove, which at that time was referred to as Queenstown.
Mhm.
But what they say today, that when we see the cruise ships pull into Cove, they're 10, 15, 20 times bigger than what the Titanic was. So, I mean, that's a big change. Joining us via the telephone, Cian, is Neil Cosgrove. And we had an opportunity to see the Irish American Heritage Month video, and we're going to close with that as well. Neil wrote that and produced that. Neil Cosgrove, did you have a question for Cian or a comment?
Yeah, I'm a little bit interested as far as this negotiation, tenants with their landlords. I mean, I think, if to be honest, sometimes that negotiation was a little bit of a shotgun wedding. I think at the case of Major Mahone up in Strokestown and Roscommon, I think he basically pulled down his tenants' houses and sent them to Grosse Ile. I think the ship was the Vespa, and I think it had a 30% mortality rate. And if you recall, and the descriptions of the St. Lawrence around Grosse Ile at that time was truly horrific. And I think but I guess maybe, I don't know whether I'm misunderstanding, but when we talk about coffin ships, they certainly seem to justify their name by those descriptions in the St. Lawrence. And I come from a mathematical background. I'm not a historian, but I'm just curious, when you're relying on letters, obviously those people who died at Grosse Ile and other places, I also remembering a coffin ship that actually wound up being blown off course, I think, into a bay up in Donegal. And when they pulled the hatches off, everybody was dead inside of it. But those poor people, their stories stop right there, unfortunately. So when you're looking at letters from people, I mean, who basically made it, is there not a bias there? Because obviously, if you traveled on a better ship, you're more inclined to make it. And you're not getting letters from the people who were, on lumber ships that were basically divided up into passenger ships. And so is there a little bit of a bias here in relying on letters as a source?
Yeah, no, that's great. That's a really good question, Neil. I would encourage you to read that, especially that opening section on mortality. I give you a brief précis of it. So the thing is that in Quebec in 1847, there is an agent sitting there who's recording all the numbers, and he's writing down all the statistics, the best statistics that he can get on who's arrived, what ship arrived, where it came from. I showed you there on that brief slide that those numbers are those are the numbers that he's crunching. So I took all of those numbers and I looked at I took out all the ports that were from Ireland, and also because so many people went through Liverpool, I looked at them, and I crunched the numbers. I mean, I looked at how many people left, how many people were born, and how many people died. And so that's how I got the mortality rate for Ireland to Quebec in 1847 at about 10%, which is still crazy high. It's crazy high, and I don't for a second suggest that it's not. But the thing is that it's also only a tiny part of a larger sample. You said you have a background in math. You'll know, like, you can't just pick the part of the sample that you want to.
Mhm.
The Strokestown Immigrants, the director of their museum, has been very helpful to me, and they have a full-time archivist who I've been working with too. Out of about 1,400 people who leave, 700 die, and they're on 4 ships, including the Virginius that has that. So I'm not for a second suggesting that these mortality rates aren't crazy. What I am suggesting is that repeating the names of these specific ships is not my job. My job is to crunch numbers from across the entire period and to try and have a big picture and see where those horrific stories fit into in their broader context. Again, it's all there in the first section of chapter 4. I hope that answers your question.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you,
you.
Neil. And again, great job on that video. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us here today for our first, and I think a brilliant way to begin Irish American Heritage Month. I would remind everybody that on Wednesday, March 9th, this Wednesday at 7 p.m., our next webinar is going to be how the Irish created a new urban culture. And Dan Taylor's done a great job of putting these together. I want to thank Chris Cook, who is behind the scenes running the show here, keeping us live. And I would like to invite Cian and then Dan for their closing comments. And we're going to take one more look at this year's Irish American Heritage Month video as we close. But Cian?
Just to say thank you. It's wonderful to be here. I'm deeply flattered to be a part of this Heritage Month, and thanks for for Dan, Danny, and Chris, and everybody. It's been a pleasure working with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and we look forward to working with you in the future. Dan Taylor, our National Ancient Order of Hibernians historian. Dan?
Thank you, Danny. I want to also thank Professor McMahon for being with us today. Really good material and some analysis from a perspective that I think many of us have not looked at before. I do want to follow up quickly on a question that Martin Galvin had posed in that discussion. And the issue was whether the emigration and the journey over and the hardships imposed reflected in the political positions of Irish Americans after they arrived. And I would note that while, of course, people on the ship were concerned with surviving and what am I going to eat, as the population of Ireland was slow to recover, the population of Americans of Irish descent really took off exponentially after the Great Hunger. And that resulted some 40 or 50 years later with a very large constituency here in the United States of Irish Americans and Irish American groups that became an advocate for Irish national self-determination. So we'll talk about that, in fact, on March 30th this year with another one of our webinars called Irish America Finds Its Voice, the AOH at the Turn of the 20th Century. So with that, thank you to everyone involved with putting this together, and we'll look forward to seeing you on Wednesday night with our next webinar.
Thank you all very much. And Chris, take it away.
A journalist visiting America in 1860 wrote, "There are several kinds of power working at the fabric of this republic: water power, steam power, and Irish power. The last works hardest of all. Irish Americans continue to power America, from building our infrastructure, to healing the sick, to rushing into harm's way as others run out. Irish names are prominent on all our rolls of valor, including 257 recipients of the Medal of Honor that list Ireland as their birthplace. Without Irish Americans, Helen Keller would not have had her miracle worker. The marginalized would have lost a voice. We would not have been challenged to reach for the moon. But the most significant contribution of Irish Americans is the story of a people who arrived from their homeland with little more than energy and determination, who have contributed and excelled in every aspect of American society, defining the American dream. March is Irish American Heritage Month.